In the year 1811, on the banks of the Meklong River in the kingdom of Siam, modern-day Thailand, a midwife froze in shock. Before her were not one, but two newborn boys, joined at the chest by a thick band of flesh. Their tiny hearts beat in separate rhythms, yet their breaths rose and fell in eerie unison. The mother, a poor fisherman's wife named Nok, stared in horror and awe. In Siamese culture, unusual births carried deep superstition, seen as omens from the spirit world. Some whispered it was a blessing, others muttered about curses. But in a village where survival depended on the tides and the harvest, what mattered most was simple. Would the babies live? They were named Chang and Eng, meaning left and right in their native tongue. Their connection wasn't just skin deep. Inside that band of flesh, doctors would later discover, lay a single fused liver and a web of shared blood vessels. At a time when medical understanding was primitive and surgery was fatal more often than not, their condition was beyond comprehension. Against every expectation, the brothers survived infancy. They learned to walk, an awkward, sideways shuffle at first, then to swim in the river casting nets with their father, their movements synchronized out of necessity. What seemed like a spectacle to strangers was simply their normal life. In their quiet village, they became known as the Connected Ones. But the outside world was beginning to change. Traders and missionaries from distant lands sailed into Siam's harbors, bringing not only goods, but strange stories of science and anatomy. When Scottish merchant Robert Hunter first saw the boys swimming near the shore, he didn't see superstition. He saw something else entirely. To him, they were not just a curiosity. They were a ticket to fame, fortune, and exploitation. What happened next would tear Chang and Eng from their homeland forever, setting them on a path toward a life both extraordinary and tragic. They would become global celebrities before they were even men, exhibited to crowds who paid to gawk, questioned by doctors desperate to understand their anatomy, and judged by societies that couldn't decide whether to fear them, pity them, or admire them. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because what awaited them in America would be stranger than anything they had faced in Siam, an existence where wealth, scandal, and an unbreakable bond would collide. It was 1829 when the brothers, just 18 years old, stepped onto the deck of an American-bound ship. The smell of salt water mixed with the unfamiliar tang of foreign spices. Behind them lay the palm trees and rice fields of Siam. Ahead was a world they could not imagine, a world that would see them not as sons, but as a spectacle. Robert Hunter had brokered a deal with an American showman named Captain Abel Coffin. The terms were simple and cold. Chang and Eng would tour the West, displayed to paying audiences as the Siamese twins. In exchange, they would be clothed, fed, and, most importantly, paid. The contract promised opportunity, but the reality would soon reveal a darker truth. Their first appearance was in Boston. The room was lit by flickering gas lamps, the air thick with anticipation. Hundreds gathered, some in fine coats and silk dresses, others in workman's garb. All had come to stare. Behind a velvet curtain, the twins stood in matching suits, hearts pounding in perfect dissonance. When the curtain drew back, the crowd gasped. Some craned forward in fascination. Others recoiled. A few whispered prayers under their breath. The brothers were poked, prodded, and asked to remove their shirts so the audience could see the fleshy bridge between them. Doctors scribbled notes furiously. Ladies fanned themselves to hide their stares. At first, the money was intoxicating. They traveled from city to city, crossing oceans to reach London, Paris, and Edinburgh. They dined in lavish hotels, saw snow for the first time, and met kings and queens. But the endless train of strangers asking the same questions. Does it hurt? Can you feel each other's pain? What if one of you dies? Soon turned their fame into a gilded cage. The exhibitions grew more invasive. Medical men demanded they submit to experiments. One insisted on pricking Chang's arm to see if Eng would bleed. The answer, yes, only deepened the fascination. The twins became less like people and more like specimens, their humanity buried under layers of curiosity and commerce. Years passed, and the tours took their toll. The brothers were no longer wide-eyed boys from Siam. They were seasoned performers who knew how to smile when the crowds were watching and collapse in exhaustion when the curtains closed. The constant travel, the invasive scrutiny, and the feeling of being owned weighed on them heavily. Then came the turning point. They had earned enough to buy their freedom from Captain Coffin's control. It was a dangerous gamble. America was a land where immigrants could easily vanish into obscurity, but they craved something they had never truly known: independence. They chose North Carolina. Rolling green fields, quiet farms, and a slower pace of life offered the promise of anonymity. Here, they could reinvent themselves, not as sideshow attractions, but as men. But as history would show, the shadows of their exhibition years would never fully leave them. When Chang and Eng Bunker arrived in rural North Carolina in the mid-1830s, the locals didn't know what to make of them. Two men, dark-skinned and foreign, speaking English with a thick accent, yet dressed like wealthy Southern gentlemen. Most startling of all, they were joined at the chest. In a region still shaped by antebellum traditions, strangers usually raised suspicion. But money spoke louder than curiosity. The brothers had saved enough from their exhibition years to purchase 150 acres of fertile farmland in Wilkes County. There, amid the rolling hills and red clay soil, they began the next chapter of their lives, not as traveling attractions, but as landowners. They worked the farm like any other men, plowing, planting, and tending livestock. But the sight of the two of them moving in perfect unison down the rows of corn became part of local lore. Over time, their skill and work ethic earned respect. They traded goods at the market, attended church, and even began to sound like their neighbors, adopting a slow, southern drawl. Still, the whispers never fully stopped. Children followed them at a distance, giggling or staring in wide-eyed silence. Some neighbors treated them with polite curiosity. Others avoided them altogether, unsure whether to see them as equals or as oddities. It was during one of their visits to the nearby town of Traffel that the brothers met the Yates sisters, Adelaide and Sarah. The sisters were daughters of a respected local family, known for their beauty and quiet charm. Whether it was love at first sight or a slow courtship remains a matter of speculation. But one thing was certain: the idea of the conjoined twins marrying anyone, let alone two sisters, was scandalous to the conservative community. The courtship was the talk of the county. Some called it unnatural. Others whispered about how such a marriage could even function. The Yates family itself was reportedly divided, with some relatives refusing to attend the eventual wedding. But Chang and Eng were not men easily swayed by gossip. They had crossed oceans, faced jeering crowds, and endured the probing hands of strangers. They were not about to let local prejudice dictate their lives. In April 1843, the two couples married in a joint ceremony. Chang wed Adelaide, Eng wed Sarah. And with those vows, the brothers' lives took an even stranger turn. Instead of one household, they would soon divide their time between two, living a life no one else in America, and perhaps the world, could fully understand. From the moment Chang and Eng exchanged vows with Adelaide and Sarah Yates, they faced a reality unlike any other in America, or perhaps in history. Two men joined by flesh and a shared liver, married to two sisters, determined to live as independent husbands and fathers. At first, the arrangement puzzled even themselves. They couldn't exactly live separate lives, yet they couldn't share the same household without inviting conflict. The solution was as unconventional as their situation. They would maintain two homes. One week, they lived with Chang's wife, Adelaide, in her home. The next, they moved, together, to Eng's wife, Sarah. And so it went, week after week, year after year. The routine was rigid, almost ceremonial. When the week was over, they packed their things, walked down the familiar dirt path, and started life in the other house just a few yards away. In time, the homes filled with children, many children. Between them, the brothers fathered 21 sons and daughters. The sound of laughter, footsteps, and the occasional squabble echoed between the two houses. But behind the scenes, life was not always harmonious. While Chang was often fiery, stubborn, and quick to speak his mind, Eng tended to be quiet, thoughtful, and diplomatic. In some families, opposite personalities balance each other. But for men who could never part physically, the differences sometimes led to simmering tension, especially when one brother disagreed with how the other handled domestic matters. The wives, too, had their own relationship, part sisterhood, part rivalry. Some accounts suggest that Adelaide and Sarah had different temperaments and occasionally clashed over the children, household duties, or even the brothers' finances. Still, they upheld the routine, and for outsiders, the Bunker family appeared surprisingly functional. Visitors from far and wide came to see the Siamese twins of North Carolina, not in a sideshow tent, but on their own land, plowing fields, attending church, and raising families like any other neighbors. To the local children, the sight of the brothers riding horseback through town, two torsos moving as one, became part of daily life. But beneath the surface of this seemingly stable arrangement, cracks were forming. The brothers were aging. Their bodies, so accustomed to constant motion, began to ache under the strain of farm work. And with each passing year, the challenge of keeping peace between two wives, two homes, and two very different personalities grew heavier. They had chosen this life in search of freedom from exploitation, but as the years wore on, it became clear that some forms of entanglement cannot be escaped, even by the strongest of wills. By the 1850s, the Bunker brothers were well known not just across Wilkes County, but throughout the South. They had gone from sideshow curiosities to respectable landowners, husbands, and fathers. But respectability did not guarantee harmony. Living bound together meant every irritation was magnified. Chang's temper, already notorious, was growing shorter with age. He liked his whiskey, more and more of it, and after a few drinks he could be sharp-tongued and impatient. Eng, the calmer of the two, resented his brother's drinking, especially when it spilled into their shared time with the wives and children. The unusual arrangement of two homes began to take its toll. Adelaide and Sarah, though sisters, had grown into very different women. Adelaide was more practical and outspoken. Sarah was quieter but could hold a grudge for years. Even small disagreements over money, over children's chores, over whose week it was to handle certain farm duties, could fester into larger disputes. Sometimes the brothers sided with their respective wives, creating a silent cold war between them. Other times they were forced into awkward neutrality, trying to keep peace while knowing that next week they would have to walk together into the other home and start the cycle all over again. And the town's gossip never really stopped. People whispered about arguments that could be heard from the road, about Chang storming out of one house only to be yanked back because Eng had no choice but to follow. The very bond that had kept them alive since birth was now the chain that kept them locked in each other's conflicts. Yet, despite the quarrels, the brothers continued to work side by side in the fields, ride into town for supplies, and even host guests curious to meet the famous Siamese twins who had carved out a life in the American South. To the public eye, they remained an unshakable pair. In private, the emotional distance between them was beginning to feel far greater than the mere inches of flesh that bound them. The 1860s brought storms the Bunker brothers could not outrun. The American Civil War erupted, and although they were not soldiers, its reach extended to every farm in North Carolina. Crops failed, prices soared, and Union troops sometimes came uncomfortably close to their land. The brothers' once profitable farm began to strain under the weight of wartime scarcity. Chang, already prone to fiery moods, found his temper fueled by another force: alcohol. His nightly drinking grew heavier, and with it came bouts of ill health. Years of physical labor and constant public appearances had worn their bodies down. Chang's face began to show signs of fatigue, his movements slower, his once powerful voice roughened by age and whiskey. Eng noticed the changes immediately. Where once they had matched each other stride for stride, now Eng sometimes had to pause for Chang to catch his breath. The shared band of flesh meant that when Chang's body suffered, Eng felt the weight of it too. Not always in pain, but in energy, in mood, in the subtle drain that came with being tethered to someone's decline. Then came the first serious blow. Chang suffered a mild stroke. His left side weakened, and though he recovered enough to walk and work, the mark it left on his health was undeniable. Eng began taking on more of the farm work, even while caring for his own growing brood of children. The strain between them deepened. Eng resented Chang's inability, or unwillingness, to give up drinking for the sake of both their lives. As the war ended and Reconstruction began, the brothers' fortunes never fully recovered. Many of their former neighbors were ruined, and the Bunkers, though better off than most, felt the pinch. Still, they held on to their land and to the strange rhythm of their shared existence, but time was becoming their enemy. They had lived far beyond what doctors of their youth had thought possible. And with every passing year, the question loomed larger. When one of them died, what would happen to the other? Would he have minutes, hours, or could he somehow survive? The answer would come sooner than either man expected, and it would come in the most haunting way imaginable. It was January 17th, 1874, in the quiet hills of Mount Airy, North Carolina. The winter air was sharp, and frost clung to the windows of the Bunker brothers' home. Inside, Chang lay in bed beside Eng, both men wrapped in heavy quilts to fight the chill. For weeks, Chang's health had been deteriorating. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. The effects of his past stroke still lingered, and whispers of pneumonia passed through the household. Eng had stayed alert, sleeping lightly, knowing that any change in his brother's condition could mean danger for them both. But that morning before dawn, Eng awoke to a stillness that was different from sleep. Chang's chest no longer rose. His skin was cold. His eyes, half open, were fixed in an unblinking stare. Eng shook him gently at first, then more urgently, panic rising in his throat. "Chang! Chang!" he called out, but there was no response. In that moment, the horrifying truth settled in. Half of him was gone. Yet still he lived. The family rushed to fetch a doctor, but the snow-covered roads delayed help. Eng lay in bed, unable to move far from the lifeless body beside him. Every moment was agony, not from physical pain, but from the unbearable knowledge that he was still tethered to his dead brother, unable to escape the inevitable. Doctors would later speculate on what happened next, but the facts are chilling. Eng survived for approximately 3 more hours after Chang's death. Some believed the shock alone was enough to stop his heart. Others argued that the shared circulatory system carried the poison of death into Eng's body. Still others claimed it was grief, that Eng simply could not, or would not, go on without his brother. By the time the physician finally arrived, both men were gone, lying side by side in the same position they had slept in since childhood. 2 lifetimes bound together from their first breath to their last. The news spread quickly, first across North Carolina, and then to newspapers as far away as London. The public was fascinated, not only by their remarkable lives, but by the eerie symmetry of their deaths. Yet, even with their bodies laid to rest, one question remained unanswered. In those final hours, did Eng die because he had to, or because he chose to? In the days following their deaths, the bunker home became a destination for the curious. Neighbors, reporters, and even strangers traveled miles to catch a final glimpse of the legendary Siamese twins. Some came to pay respects, others came for the spectacle. But for the medical community, their passing was not the end. It was an opportunity. The brothers' bodies were transported to Philadelphia, where physicians and anatomists gathered to perform one of the most talked-about autopsies of the era. What they found confirmed what had long been suspected. Chang and Eng shared a fused liver and a network of blood vessels so intertwined that separating them in life would have been nearly impossible without killing them both. The findings answered some questions, but they left others hanging in the air. How much of each man's physical sensation was shared? Could one have survived longer if separation had been attempted in time? And in those final moments, did Eng feel Chang's death pass through him like a current, or did his heart simply break from the loss? Their bodies, or parts of them, would remain preserved in medical collections, studied by generations of students. In death, as in life, they were still subjects of fascination, half human story, half medical marvel. Back in North Carolina, their widows raised the surviving children. Over time, the bunker name spread through the region, their descendants living ordinary lives far from the circus tents and lecture halls that once defined their fathers. Today, many of their great-great-grandchildren still live in the area, carrying a last name that has become part of American folklore. The brothers' story continues to inspire books, documentaries, plays, and even operas. To some, they are symbols of resilience, 2 men who defied the odds and carved out full lives despite impossible circumstances. To others, they remain a mystery, a case study in human connection taken to the most literal and extreme form. And, perhaps, that's why their legacy endures. Because at its heart, the story of Chang and Eng Bunker is more than medical anomaly or historical oddity. It is a story about the limits of independence, the bonds we do not choose, and the way 2 lives can be so deeply entwined that even death itself cannot break them cleanly apart. More than a century later, the question still lingers. If you were bound to another soul from birth to death, would it be a gift or a prison?